Dude, we are going to energise the country.
We need to wake up and smell the coffee.
The independence case is a powerful one.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Kevin Hickson, Senior Lecturer in British Politics at the University of Liverpool, author and editor of a number of excellent political books, including the one that we will be discussing today, the recently released Neil Kinnock, Saving the Labour Party. Welcome to the podcast, Kevin.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
It's great to have you on. Now, the first question that I'd like to ask is, you mentioned at the start, in the start of the book, that you have, of course, written and edited these types of books on previous prime ministers, but not a leader of the opposition before. What made you decide to do this book on Neil Kinnock?
Yeah, that's right. So 3 previous books on prime ministers, John Major and then 2 former Labour leaders, Wilson and Callaghan. But this was the first one, as you say, on a leader of the opposition. But 2 reasons, really. I mean, first of all, I think Kinnock is a very significant figure in the history of the Labour Party, leader of the opposition for 9 years, 9 very difficult, tumultuous years in the Labour Party. But also, there's a contemporary significance, I think, to the book, in the sense that Kinnock came to the leadership after the 1983 defeat, which was a previous occasion where the left of the party had been dominant and ended up with a significant electoral defeat in 83. Similar parallel position with Starmer, of course, after the 2019 election defeat and the end of Corbynism.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I found interesting reading the book is that comparative element, as you mentioned there, between Starmer and Kinnock. Do you think that Starmer faces the same sort of scale of challenge as Kinnock? Because in the interview with Anthony Seldon, which Neil Kinnock gives as part of this book, Anthony asks him about whether he feels he can compare what he had to undergo as leader of the Labour Party with what Keir Starmer is dealing with at the moment. I mean, how similar do you think the comparison really is?
Well, there's certainly a similarity there. As I said, both come into power after the Labour Party had a very heavy defeat. I mean, the 2019 election result was the worst since the 1930s. Previously, the 1983 result had been the worst since the 1930s. Both facing issues in terms of internal party management. It took Kinnock longer to deal with those. I think the scale of the challenges that Kinnock faced in terms of internal party management were greater even than Starmer has faced. I mean, Starmer faced the legacy of momentum, but momentum wasn't the same thing as the militant tendency, which has successfully infiltrated the Labour Party in the 70s and the early 1980s, which Kinnock had to face. And he had to show great personal courage on occasions, such as the 1985 party conference speech, where he took on the militant tendency and began the process of purging the party. Also faced huge electoral challenges, and ultimately, of course, Kinnock didn't make it. He failed to become Prime Minister. But if anything, the scale of the electoral challenge which Starmer faces now, I'd argue, is greater, because back in Kinnock's day, back in the 1980s, Labour was still the dominant party in Scotland. That's no longer the case. It's also lost the so-called red wall seats of traditional Labour heartlands in the north and the Midlands, which remain loyal to the Labour Party during Kinnock's period. So in terms of party management, I would say the problems faced by Kinnock were greater than those that Starmer has faced. But in terms of formulating a successful electoral winning strategy, I would say that Starmer's challenges there are even greater than the ones that Kinnock faced.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, just going back to that interview between Kinnock and Anthony Seldon, that I thought was particularly interesting is towards the end of the interview, when discussing how the Labour Party would have been different had he not become leader, Kinnock says, "I'm not naturally a nasty bastard, but I was enough of a nasty bastard to do what was necessary." Now, do you think that there is something in that there needed to be this sort of like real edge, this ruthlessness in whoever was going to take on the leadership of the Labour Party post 1983 to ensure that it could go on to become an election winning machine again? Or do you think that the party would have been able to become an election winning party again, had someone who perhaps didn't have the same sort of vitriolic hatred of some of his enemies as Kinnock seemed to have?
No, I think only Kinnock could have become leader in 1983 because he was previously associated with the left. He'd been a very left-wing critic of Jim Callaghan's government, which he consistently refused to join. But after the 79 election defeat, he moves away from what became known as the hard left. He was very loyal to Michael Foot, but very critical of Tony Benn. And the party was the centre of gravity in the party after the 83 election defeat, was still very much firmly on the centre left or the soft left. Roy Hattersley was its main rival for the leadership in 83. Hattersley was seen as the right-wing candidate and therefore couldn't win. But Hattersley admitted later on, after the 85 conference speech, which I mentioned before, the one attacking the militant tendency, that the party had after all picked the right leader in 1983, because Hattersley's approach to politics, which is more of a kind of intellectual approach. Hattersley was stronger on the ideas and the policy development. But the actual kind of organisational politics that was necessary to defeat the hard left, the dirty tricks, the ruthlessness, was where Kinnock was certainly strong on that. And without that, the party wouldn't have recovered.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Just turning to Kinnock Socialism, which is the essay that you wrote for the book. One of the things that I find interesting is that the two figures that you pick upon to explain Kinnock's values as opposed to ideology, his values are R.H. Tawney and Honorin Bevan. Now, Bevan, what do you think those two thinkers have in common? Or do you think that they represent two different sides of Kinnock's values, his beliefs, his sort of like ideological drive?
Well, Tawney, I think, is a figure who commands respect across the ideological spectrum within the Labour Party, but particularly, and Neil very often quotes this, the extract from Tawney, which included in the chapter where he talks about the need to capture the institutions of the state. So Kinnock certainly believed that you couldn't achieve socialism by extra parliamentary means or purely extra parliamentary means. He was critical of those who thought that you should primarily engage in extra parliamentary protest or trade union action and forget about the need to win a general election, which is the whole rationale for Kinnock's modernisation project, recovering the electability of the Labour Party. Bevan was his great hero, growing up in South Wales in a coal mining community. Bevan, the great Welsh orator, was very much a hero figure for Neil Kinnock and for Kinnock's mentor Michael Foot as well. And he drew on not only the ideas of Bevan, I would say, but also the political style. Kinnock is probably the greatest political orator in my lifetime. Just as those who saw Bevan in action in the 1940s, 1950s, said that he was the greatest orator of that period.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, just you mentioned there, the idea of capturing the apparatus of the state. One of the things that I find interesting is the view that's expressed of the state being a neutral arbiter. It's not necessarily either a positive or a negative force. It depends who is in control, who is the government. Why do you think that that's a view that some, particularly further to the left of Kinnock, maybe on the far left, if you will, see this as sort of like as a problematic view, when really you can see it being quite a logical one, that the state, acting particular ways dependent on who is in government, rather than necessarily it's sort of like having its own innate culpability, if you will, or its own innate inability to do the things that they want it to do.
Yeah, I mean, two very different views of the state there. It goes back to debates between socialists at the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century. When the Labour Party was formed in 1900, it was very much committed to what's usually referred to as the Fabian notion of the state, that the state is essentially neutral between competing political interests. If a Conservative government is elected, it will do Conservative things, but if a Labour government is elected, it would do socialist things, and that the institutions of the state, the civil service and so forth, would implement the views of its political masters. And that view very much inspired the Labour Party, just as it did other socialist and social democratic parties across Western Europe, really. And therefore the Labour Party became committed from quite an early stage, really, to the main tenets of the Westminster model of the British Constitution, the idea that the first past the post system is beneficial because it's more likely to return majority governments for a single party rather than the more kind of coalitionist politics that proportional representation would tend towards. So that was very much part of the Labour Party's thinking. It was there with the comments that you mentioned before, Tawney. It was certainly Bevan's view, but across the political spectrum of the Labour Party, even after the 1951 election defeat and the long period of opposition it had in not getting back into government again until 1964, really all strands of the Labour Party at that point maintained their faith in the first past the post electoral system. And that faith only really began to be seriously questioned after the third successive election defeat that Labour had in 1987, where some in the party seriously began to consider changing the electoral system and going down a more potentially more coalitionist form of politics. On the radical left, you always had a more kind of Marxist-inspired view that the state was really a capitalist state, and even if the Socialist Political Party, in this case the Labour Party, obtained a parliamentary majority, then it would be stopped by the forces of capitalism from introducing socialist policies. And that view was more influential, as you say, on the left of the party. But Kinnock always believed that you could implement socialist policies as long as you secured a parliamentary majority. But in order to do that, you needed to follow public opinion as well as trying to shape it.
Indeed, and you mention the need to follow public opinion. And in Jeremy Nuttall's essay, he focuses very much on Kinnock and the people and the importance that Neil Kinnock felt whilst leader of the Labour Party towards reflecting the views and the beliefs of the people, particularly as those evolved over the 1980s and people became arguably more consumerist than they had been previously. Though, of course, you can go back to the 50s to see the roots of that as well with Macmillan. But I just wonder, how important do you think it was that he shifted the party in the direction that he felt people were moving in, rather than perhaps maybe argued a bit more on some of the issues that he had felt and that the Labour Party had felt were important for so many years? For example, housing, the right to buy, etc. Do you think that perhaps that softening towards that, perhaps not being as hostile towards it, meant a greater acceptance of these ideas in general political discourse, and it might have been more constructive had Kinnock pushed back against those ideas?
Well, yes. I mean, Kinnock was always inspired by a belief that in the people as they really were, and he believed he had a sense of this from being grounded in community life in South Wales and a direct understanding of how working people felt about various issues. And that was then reinforced by the focus on following focus groups and opinion poll data as a guide to developing the Labour Party's policy, particularly after the 87 election defeat. And it was, again, very critical of the radical left of the party, who he thought had an idealised view of the working class, which was never really borne out in reality, he thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to focus again in terms of Neil Kinnock's personality, looking forward to the 1992 election, which we've not really touched upon so much. There were a feeling, some felt that perhaps maybe to overuse that quote from the West Wing, let Bartlett be Bartlett, that there wasn't enough letting Kinnock be Kinnock in that 1992 election, that perhaps there was a bit too much stage management that sort of jarred with his personality. I mean, what do you think of that argument? Do you think that there was perhaps a bit too much of that in 92? Or do you think that simply this is a way that people have tried to explain the 92 defeat, rather than it simply being that there was a change in Prime Minister and people were open to seeing how John Major would do in comparison to Margaret Thatcher?
Well, it was certainly one of the features of the Kinnock leadership that things had to be done more professionally, particularly after the 83 election campaign, which was shambolic. And in the 87 election, commentators felt that Labour had run the best campaign. It was much more polished and professional campaign, using people like Peter Mandelson, who had come into the party at that stage. There are a number of gaffes, however, in the 92 election campaign. Most notably, now the one that's really remembered is Kinnock's "We're all right" speech at the Sheffield rally a few days before the election campaign. So the 92 campaign didn't run as smoothly as the 87 election campaign had done, and some commentators felt that was an explanation as to why Labour lost the 92 election, because the opinion polls had seemed to predict that Labour was going to win, or at least be the biggest party in a hung parliament. And of course, that didn't materialise. The Conservatives won their fourth election in a row, albeit with a reduced majority, but still a fairly comfortable majority of over 20 seats. And so people started to look for reasons why Labour had lost the election, why the opinion polls had been wrong, why the election went in the way that a lot of people hadn't predicted. And some blame those short-term gaffes during the election campaign. But I think really certainly one of the other issues, as you rightly said, was that the Conservative leader had changed. Margaret Thatcher had been removed from office against her will at the end of 1990. She had been replaced by John Major, in many ways carried on Thatcherite policies, but had a much softer political style. Kinnock was better suited to being opposed to being contrasted with Margaret Thatcher. The contrast with John Major didn't really work so well. And also Kinnock, because he changed his mind on pretty much every issue during the course of his leadership, in an attempt to modernise the party. He'd given up on all of the things which he previously subscribed to, really, come down to different views on the economy, on the constitution, on nuclear weapons, on European integration, and so on. And I think there was a feeling that Labour wasn't really trusted sufficiently in the 92 election, and the fact that Kinnock had changed his mind on so much fed into that kind of narrative, and Labour wasn't trusted on the economy and on tax in particular. I think that was the real reason that Labour lost the 92 election. Unfortunately, it then rather learned the wrong lesson from this, which is that it became, certainly after the death of John Smith in 94, in the run-up to the 97 election, New Labour became very cautious indeed. And Blair won a huge landslide, and I don't want to take away from Blair's achievement, but almost any leader could have won in the 97 election, albeit it might have been a smaller majority, but Labour could still have had a comfortable majority and could have introduced a more radical political agenda.
And it's interesting you should mention that, because that in the Selden interview, that point is put to him by Anthony Selden, what it would have been like in 97 had Gordon Brown been leader, and he suggests that Labour would have still won, of course, but with a smaller majority, and that perhaps had Gordon Brown been Prime Minister in 97 as opposed to 2007, he might have had a bit more self-confidence and been a bit more radical than perhaps Tony Blair was. I mean, how truthful do you think that is? Do you think that Gordon Brown in 1997 might have introduced a more radical policy had he been Prime Minister than Tony Blair?
Well, as I said before, I think almost any leader could have won the 97 election. If Kinnock had somehow carried on, he may well have won in 97. Had John Smith lived, he may well have won. He would have won the election as well. And I'm sure that had Gordon Brown not done that deal with Tony Blair and stood, then he also would have won. And he would have been certainly a different leader then, a much more confident leader than he was by the time he did become Prime Minister in 2007. By then, he'd simply been Chancellor for too long and been very damaged by the internecine conflicts that we now know were taking place between number 10 and number 11 Downing Street. So I certainly think that Brown would have been would have won the election in 97, would have been perhaps more radical than Blair, and certainly would have been a different style of leader than he ended up being a decade later.
Mm. One of the points that I think is particularly interesting is the essay on Kinnock's One Nation socialism, the idea of socialism matched with patriotism. And if you see interviews with Kinnock now, and even going back previously in a number of years, you will see the importance that he places on that mixture between socialism, social democratic reforms, and with a patriotic belief in one's country. How much do you think that was a contentious point for people in the Labour Party in the 1980s, that mixing of patriotism and socialism? Because certainly if you look at the Labour Party, both under Jeremy Corbyn and now under Keir Starmer, there seems to be quite a stark disconnect between different wings of the party, those who are happy to embrace patriotism and things associated with that, and then those who are quite aghast in it in one way or another, or who are very much opposed to it.
Well, even during Kinnock's period, there were those who were critical of the direction of the party. Kinnock was certainly patriotic in the sense of being a committed unionist. He opposed devolution in the 1970s as something that was pandering to Welsh nationalism. We believed that if you were working class and English or working class and Welsh, you still had the same kind of problems, and that they could only really be dealt with through the United Kingdom Parliament at Westminster. All of his cultural references, of course, were Welsh. He was very much steeped in Welsh politics and Welsh history, where he'd grown up. I think today the Labour Party does have a real problem in terms of patriotism. This is something I've written about elsewhere. The party became, and again, this is one of the changes that came in during Kinnock's period, because Kinnock had historically been a Eurosceptic, opposed to membership of the EC, and ends up becoming a pro-European, and that change occurred quite quickly. But after Kinnock had gone, the party continued to become more and more pro-European, to the extent that in the 2016 referendum, it was overwhelmingly Remain, and there was a clear disconnect between the Labour parliamentary elite and lots of Labour voters, particularly in more traditional working class areas, the so-called red wall seats. And you see that over Brexit. where the Parliamentary Labour Party was overwhelmingly Remain, and lots of Labour voters in those areas were overwhelmingly Leave. You see there are issues such as immigration and so forth. And I think the party in particular has an issue with Englishness. It feels instinctively uncomfortable about England and all things which are deemed English. And unless it comes to terms with that, unless it develops a more kind of sympathetic understanding of England and Englishness, it's not going to reconnect those voters that it lost in 2019.
Looking at the book as a whole, you've had in the book you have contributions from John Redwood, John Landsman, a variety of people across the political spectrum. Was it important for you when you were making the book, when you were editing the essays, that you had contributions from across the Labour Party and even those outside the Labour Party to give the most diverse view and series of perspectives on Kinnock as possible?
Absolutely, that's something that I've tried to do in my other edited books as well, to have people who would be more sympathetic to in this case, to Kinnock, and those who would be more critical, whether that criticism be from the Conservative side of politics, that you mentioned. John Redwood was one of the contributors, and also critics on the left of the party, John Landsman, Hilary Wainwright, who knew would take a more critical view of Neil Kinnock. So one of the aims with these books is to try to have opinion diversity, and the other is also to bring in a mix of academics and non-academics, whether they be policy advisors, politicians, journalists or whatever, to try and break down that divide as well between academic and non-academic writers.
Mm-hmm. We're coming towards the end of the podcast. It's been great to speak to you, Kevin, and I have one final question for you. Now, of course, Neil Kinnock's time as leader of the Labour Party coincided with a great blossoming of British satire and comedy, and of course, most popular and most associated with Neil Kinnock is, of course, Spitting Image. So my final question to you, Kevin, is this. If you had to own any original Spitting Image puppet, and you have no choice about whether you want to own it or not, but you had to own it, which original Spitting Image puppet would you choose to own?
Gosh, that's a great question. I think the Roy Hattersley one was iconic, wasn't it? So I would say that, really.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent choice. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast, Kevin. If people want to find out more about the book and more about you, where should they go to find out more about the book? Where can they buy the book and find out more about you?
Okay, well, the book's available it's published by Routledge. It's on their website. You can buy it through Amazon. And as you said in the introduction, I work at the University of Liverpool. So I'm on the website there and also on Twitter.
Excellent. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.